Okay, so I think we all agree that a level of regulation is definitely needed, but we understand that compliance shouldn't stifle any innovation. But that's just it. Innovation, I think, doesn't and regulation doesn't need to be overly complex for retail banks to get their heads around. I mean, surely there should be a level of them or us providing technology for them to do more for less. Jens-Henrik, do you want to sort of talk about some of the, I don't know, technologies that we're trying to put into banks that can maybe help them do that, be more efficient and yet compliant?
Sure. So actually, I want to pick up on the comment you just made about compliance not necessarily, let's say, hurting or damaging the efficiency. Actually, I think it's actually two sides of the same coin.
Traditionally, it probably has done, but maybe not. Hopefully, in the future.
I think it's actually two sides of the same coin, because I think that technology can very significantly help improve the efficiency, and by automating processes, by helping taking out human errors, etc., etc. And by putting these solutions in place, not only do you increase the efficiency, and thereby freeing up the time for people in the branches to spend more time towards customer-facing activities, etc., etc., upsell financial products, etc. But also, that technology allows you to actually provide more transparent processes. You have much more visibility of how the processes are working, how they are running, and the compliance aspect of that is by default, let's say, inherently built into these solutions. So you can provide total audit capabilities, tracking capabilities of when specific transactions were made, at what time, by whom, etc., etc. So I think it's by implementing these technology solutions, you actually achieve the efficiency, and at the same time you also achieve the compliance and the audit capabilities and the transparency. So to me, it's actually two sides of the same coin. And I don't think compliance and audit capability needs in any way to hamper efficiency of process. Actually, I think it's inherent in many of the technology solutions which we are providing.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, I do see one of the things about both regulations coming into place and the technologies coming into place is that both of them should make banking safer, which is what banking primarily should be about, safety, and also they should be making it, well, to a degree more efficient. Compliance doesn't necessarily add to efficiency, but technology certainly should. Yeah. Both of these things are necessary at the moment, and both of them should be applied.
Absolutely.
It's clear that we have different solutions to do the dematerialization of manual processes. By automating those processes, you create this transparency. Sometimes we are blocked by the lack of appetite of banks to implement some standards and automation. Give you an example, we are a large corporate, and we have about 200,000 business relationships in our supply chain. In order to run this, the financial supply chain itself is covered by about 500 banking relationships. So what we need to do internally is to manage the authorization. Who within HP in the different countries is authorized to submit some payments, and what are the limits, and for what accounts. So we manage all of this from an electronic point of view. We have a database with the user rights, and we transfer the information to the banks. The problem is that the banks need to receive the information by fax. So we fax the information to them, and we have no feedback whatsoever the way they have implemented the mirror image of our information. So at any time, we have potentially some exposure that some employees that left the company still have into the banking system the authorization to do payment on behalf of HP. We discussed with the bank about it, and it's very simple. It's adoption of a standard for the bank mandate. But of course, the appetite to implement it with regard to the different priorities of the bank is very low.
Would it be useful, I don't know whether or not you use Swift as a corporate, but to be a corporate member of Swift that could potentially assist with that, I imagine, because then you only have one standard you have to use, but at the same time it's fairly expensive as well. Trying to think how that would work. Then again, the banks would save their money on going through Swift, wouldn't they? It might be one solution, I suppose, but it would be an expensive solution, I imagine.
So Swift is a large customer of HP. They are using our technology to run their network. Their scope are changing. It's a good news, because so far they implemented standardization of the relationship between banks. Now they are slowly opening up to the relationship between banking corporates, meaning that slowly you will see some more standards for the corporates to dialogue with their banks, and vice versa. And they open up the network to corporates. So, but it's still a slow process.
I think one of the things with compliance and just feeds back into everything else we've been saying, is about the sort of the transparency of what's going on in terms of technology. I know you said earlier it might not be the case for sort of different generation to generation who wants, for example, who would be willing or be happy to receive a product on child benefit after just having a child. I just personally, I would still be slightly horrified if that happened to me, but maybe less so if, to begin with, which feeds back to kind of transparency, if there was something, or sort of a box on the site, the online banking, which says, do you want us to, not put it so bluntly, but do you want us to monitor your purchases to send you something, that would be okay. But if I'd received that otherwise, that would be something, which would kind of disturb me slightly. So going back to the regulation kind of thing, I mean, that all needs to be, I think, laid out, rather than, okay, these things are all very well and good, but if they're not being fed through to the customer, not just the end product, but a lot of the stages at the same time, from regulations and the technology, then you're in danger of alienating them even more unless you've
raised another key point there as well, aside from the fact that, yes, I think it's about, rather than trying to simplify it on generation, maybe to allow people to set preferences if they, and make it clear why you're doing it, what you're doing. But that's another thing where banks keep falling down, where some personalized explanations would come in useful, that a lot of the time when banks do something that seems strange to the customer, yes, I know I'm speaking in defense of banks here, okay, but a lot of the time what the bank does is actually what the bank has to do. Sometimes they're hiding behind certain regulations, but there are lots of situations where what the bank does is what the bank has to do. But because they don't explain to you that that's why they're having to do it, you get all aggrieved about it. Whereas, and a lot of time when you complain and you get the explanation saying, well, if only they told me that. If banks figured out how to get rid of the, well, if only you told me that situation, again, we would probably think just a little bit more highly of them.
But I think it also comes back to the personalized experience which we talked about before, because instead of trying to provide some capabilities where one size fits all, right, then instead you could actually go to your customers and you could ask them for their consent to, for example, monitor their expense structure or whatever. And by doing that, you could also let them know that if you gave them that capability or allowed them to do that, you actually would enjoy these and these benefits and in a much more personalized experience. So therefore the banks, they need to build these capabilities and then actually apply them towards customers based on what they like and what they prefer and what they give their consent to.
I think they'd have to be fairly careful about what they did in some of this cross-selling, because if all of a sudden they phoned me up and said, we know you've got your house insurance with Direct Line and we can beat it, and I hadn't even ticked a box saying I was remotely interested in house I would be very upset. If I did it the other way round and said, I am contemplating changing my some of my insurances, and they could data mine and look at who you've used. That'd be quite good.
I do know that some of this comes back from, 8 years ago, when people were doing internet banking for the first time around, and we're doing things like WAP banking as well. For example, people sending, or banks sending birthday cards to people by email, that sort of thing, and people going, I really don't appreciate that. You're a bank. Let's face it, you don't actually wish me happy birthday for an organisation. So that backfired a little, and WAP banking didn't go down so well. But it being customer-led, the chances are we are going to come to a situation where the banks have to react to things like Facebook to public profiles and, as we've discussed, push services out to the customer via the customer's chosen route. And the customer's chosen route may not be what banks are spending money on. So they are going to have to take great care in listening to these next generations and how they're using technology.